There's a weapon off the coast of Iran that could end the drone war forever. Somewhere in the Gulf right now, a US Navy destroyer is carrying a system that doesn't fire bullets, doesn't fire missiles, and doesn't even make a sound. And if it works the way the Navy says it does, it may be quietly solving one of the most expensive, most frustrating problems the American military has faced in this entire conflict. This is the story of a laser floating off the Iranian coast, the war that forced it into existence, the ceasefire that was supposed to end that war, and the collapse that just happened 3 days ago. If you're enjoying this analysis, don't forget to subscribe to Cartovex Media, because the next few minutes completely change the picture. Let's start with the problem this weapon was actually built to solve, because you can't understand why it matters until you understand how badly Iran's drone strategy had been working against the United States. Since the war between the United States, Israel and Iran erupted at the end of February 2026, Iran leaned hard on one weapon above all others: cheap, mass-produced attack drones. The specific model is the Shahed 136, a Tehran-built kamikaze drone that reportedly costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. That is remarkably cheap for a weapon that can fly hundreds of miles and detonate on impact. But here's where the real problem begins, and it has nothing to do with how dangerous the drone itself is. It's about what it costs the United States just to shoot one down. According to reporting from Euronews, when American forces intercept a single Shahed using a Patriot missile, that one interception can cost somewhere between $3 and $4 million. Switch to a THAAD interceptor, and the price climbs past $10 million. Sit with that math for a second. Iran spends as little as $20,000 to build the threat. The United States spends up to 500 times that just to erase it. That is not simply an expensive war. That is a broken equation. One where the side spending exponentially more is still the one bleeding resources faster with every exchange. This wasn't an abstract worry debated quietly in Washington think tanks. It showed up almost immediately in the war's actual price tag. Just 3 weeks into the conflict, a Trump administration official confirmed the war had already cost the United States $12 billion, or nearly $1 billion a day. Iran's entire annual defense budget for 2025 sat at roughly $23 billion total, a fraction of what America spends in a single year. But the specific cost of intercepting cheap drones with expensive missiles was creating exactly the kind of financial bleed no military wants to be trapped inside, no matter how large its overall budget is. So the United States needed a different kind of answer, something that could kill a $20,000 drone without spending millions of dollars to do it. That's where this laser enters the story. It's called HELIOS, short for high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance, deliberately named after the Greek god of the sun. According to multiple defense outlets, HELIOS is a 60-kilowatt class directed energy weapon built by Lockheed Martin, integrated directly into the Aegis combat system used aboard Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. It works in 2 modes. At lower power, it can dazzle a target, scrambling a drone's guidance system badly enough that the aircraft crashes on its own. At higher power, it kills the target outright, overheating its structure or its electronics until it simply stops functioning mid-flight. Here's what makes this weapon genuinely remarkable from a purely financial standpoint. A Patriot or a THAAD interceptor is a single-use missile, fired once and is gone forever, along with several $1 million. A laser like HELIOS just needs electrical power. According to defense analysts covering the deployment, each individual shot costs a tiny fraction of a missile interception, often described as just a few dollars of electricity per engagement. If that holds up under real combat conditions, it doesn't just save money, it rewrites the entire economic logic of fighting a drone war. Now let's talk about where this laser actually is, and how it got there. According to Euronews and the Defense News, HELIOS is installed and operational aboard the USS Preble, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, deployed off the coast of Iran as part of the broader campaign known as Operation Epic Fury. That operation began on February 28, 2026, when US and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes against Iran following the collapse of nuclear negotiations. Footage released by CENTCOM shows the laser mounted near the destroyer's forward section, confirmed installed and operational while American forces run both offensive and defensive missions across the region. But the opening strike did something almost nobody expected on day one. Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in the operation's opening hours, and Iran responded with waves of missiles and drones aimed at Israeli territory and American bases across the Gulf. The Navy's confidence in this laser did not appear out of nowhere. According to the Navy's own Office of the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, HELIOS aboard the Preble had already destroyed a single drone during testing back in 2024. Then, in early February 2026, just weeks before the war began, the Navy ran a far more ambitious live-fire demonstration at sea. According to confirmation from USNI proceedings and multiple defense publications, HELIOS destroyed 4 separate drones in a single exercise, the first confirmed multi-target engagement for the system. Lockheed Martin's own CEO, Jim Taiclet, publicly celebrated the milestone on a quarterly earnings call, framing it as proof the technology was finally ready for real combat. So, when the war actually broke out weeks later, the Navy didn't send an unproven experiment into the Gulf. It sent a system that had just shown, under controlled conditions, that it could track and destroy multiple targets in a single engagement. But here's where I need to be honest with you, because this is exactly the kind of detail that separates a grounded understanding from the kind of overhyped claims that spread easily online. Despite HELIOS being confirmed as deployed, neither the US Navy nor Israel's military officially confirmed that laser weapons were being used in active combat during the operation. The New York Post reported, citing sources familiar with the operation, that HELIOS had already been used against Iranian drones. But primary military sources never publicly confirmed the exact number of combat kills once real fighting began. That distinction matters. We know the weapon was there. We know it worked in testing. We have reporting suggesting it was actively firing in combat. But an officially confirmed kill count never materialized, and that gap was left for outside observers to interpret on their own. And HELIOS wasn't fighting this war alone. Along the Israel-Lebanon border, a separate but related picture was unfolding, with rockets exploding at altitude before reaching their targets. Analysts widely, though unofficially, attributed this to Israel's own laser system, Iron Beam, engaging Hezbollah rockets, mortars, and drones at a reported cost of just $2 to $5 per shot, compared to $50,000 Tamir interceptors. Two laser systems, two allied militaries, operating in the same conflict without either government confirming it on the record. Now let's talk about the scale of the threat these systems were built to counter, because understanding the pressure on the region explains why a cheap interception method mattered so much. According to reporting from the Defense News, Gulf states alone reportedly intercepted more than 750 drones and over 170 ballistic missiles since the war began. An overwhelming volume of incoming threats, and every single interception carried that same brutal cost imbalance. If even a fraction of that volume could eventually be handled by lasers instead of multi-million-dollar missiles, the financial relief for American and allied forces could be enormous. But raw interception numbers only tell part of the story. Behind every one of those 750 drones was a defensive network working around the clock just to spot the threat in time. Satellites operated by the US Space Force using infrared sensors detect the heat signature of a launch almost the moment it happens. That data gets routed to facilities called radomes, structures that resemble oversized golf balls, where personnel calculate trajectories and decide, often within seconds, whether a Patriot battery, a THAAD system, or a laser like HELIOS is the right tool for that specific threat. It's a layered defense built for a war being fought at machine speed, where the difference between a successful intercept and a hit on a populated area can come down to a matter of seconds. Inside the radar dome, most people will never see. There's also a broader build-up happening around this deployment worth understanding, because HELIOS wasn't operating in isolation. According to Naval today, the aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush arrived in the Middle East in late April, joining the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford already in the region. For the first time in decades, 3 American aircraft carriers were operating simultaneously in the Middle East, backed by more than 200 aircraft and roughly 15,000 personnel. Notably, the George H.W. Bush arrived carrying its own newly tested drone-killing laser, suggesting the Navy's strategy involves expanding this technology across the fleet, not just relying on the single system aboard the Preble. But no serious analysis of this weapon should pretend it's some kind of unstoppable magic solution. According to detailed reporting from the Kiev Post, real questions remain about how the system performs under sustained combat stress. Lasers can only engage one target at a time. Effectiveness diminishes with distance. Smoke, dust, and weather all interfere with the beam, and all of those conditions are common across the Middle East. Shipboard systems also have to survive saltwater exposure, rough seas, and demanding cooling requirements just to keep functioning over long deployments. A controlled test destroying 4 drones in ideal conditions is impressive. A coordinated swarm attacking from multiple directions in real combat is a considerably harder problem. That's also why the Navy, according to the War Zone, still classifies HELIOS as a non-program of record research and development asset, meaning even now, in an active war, it's formally still an experimental system, not standard equipment. And yet, here's what makes this deployment carry real weight anyway. According to the War Zone, members of Congress have pushed the Navy to develop a containerized version of HELIOS, a modular design that could be installed across far more ships. The Navy's own Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Daryl Caudle, has said publicly he wants to, in his own words, containerize everything, from towed array systems to drone swarms to high-powered lasers. An early draft of the 2027 Defense Policy Bill reportedly includes funding for both a containerized HELIOS variant and a broader maritime laser program. That's Congress in real time, watching how a weapon performs in an active war and moving to fund its expansion before the war has even finished. So where does that leave the laser? Deployed, tested, reportedly firing, officially unconfirmed. That was the picture as of the spring, but here's what almost nobody outside defense circles fully grasped at the time. The laser was never the actual ending to this story. It was only ever a subplot inside something enormously larger. Because this war didn't quietly fade away, it paused, and then just days ago, it came roaring back. Operation Epic Fury, the US codename for the joint military campaign with Israel, officially concluded on May 5, 2026, after a little over 2 months of direct strikes. In that window, the opening salvo had killed Khamenei and triggered hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones fired across the Middle East. Thousands of people were killed across Iran, Lebanon, Israel, and the Gulf states, and millions were displaced. After more than 5 weeks of fighting, the United States and Iran agreed to a ceasefire on April 7th and 8th, mediated by Pakistan, which also extended to Israel. But that ceasefire was violated by both sides almost immediately, and on April 21st, President Trump extended it indefinitely at Pakistan's request, buying Tehran more time to formalize its position. But here's where the story shifts from missiles to something far quieter, and in some ways far more dangerous. A stretch of water, barely 30 miles wide at its narrowest points. The Strait of Hormuz. In the weeks after the ceasefire, the conflict shifted into a game of brinkmanship over that single waterway. Iran refused to fully reopen it, and by March 10th, only 15 ships had made it through in a single day, compared to roughly 110 ships a day before the war. The United States responded with a full naval blockade on Iran. Iran called any entry of military vessels near the strait a ceasefire violation and threatened to respond accordingly. Around the same time, Iranian drones struck Iraqi Kurdistan, and reports counted 16 separate missile and drone attacks hitting the region even after the ceasefire had technically begun. Diplomacy kept grinding forward anyway. On March 25th, Pakistani officials delivered a 15-point American ceasefire proposal to Iran, covering everything from Iran's nuclear program to sanctions relief. Iran rejected it. An anonymous Iranian official told Press TV that Iran would end the war when it decides to do so, and Tehran issued its own 5-point counterproposal, demanding an end to strikes on Lebanon and Iraq, security guarantees, war reparations, and international recognition of Iranian control over Hormuz. On March 31st, Pakistan and China jointly proposed a 5-point initiative calling for an immediate end to hostilities. None of it stuck cleanly, but the pressure to end the war kept building anyway, month after month. Then, on June 14th, mediators announced something bigger, a memorandum of understanding intended to formally end the war within 60 days. 3 days later, on June 17th, in one of the more surreal diplomatic images of the entire conflict, President Trump signed that memorandum during a dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Palace of Versailles following the G7 summit. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed the same document in Tehran. Pakistan confirmed the signing meant Iran would reopen Hormuz instantly, and the American blockade would end immediately. CENTCOM confirmed the blockade had been lifted the very next day. On June 19th, Trump also announced a renewed ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in the parallel Lebanon war, brokered with Qatar and Iran's help. For a moment, it genuinely looked like the war was over. But that's only part of the story, and the next part is the part almost nobody saw coming. Tensions kept escalating anyway. On June 28th, despite multiple clashes, the US and Iran agreed once again to halt their exchange of attacks, essentially repatching a ceasefire that was already fraying at the seams less than 2 weeks after being signed at Versailles. And then, on July 6th and 7th, just days ago, Iran allegedly struck multiple commercial ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The United States responded immediately with strikes across more than 80 locations inside Iran, targeting air defenses, coastal radar sites, and command and control networks along the southern coastline. Speaking at a NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey on July 8th, President Trump said flatly that the ceasefire was over. "There's something wrong with them," he said of Iran's leadership. "They're cuckoo. As far as I'm concerned, it's over." The very next day, he softened slightly, suggesting the exchange of fire wouldn't necessarily mean a full return to long-term military action. But by July 10th, Iran's chief negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, said Tehran remained deeply distrustful of Washington, warning that this conflict will never end with Iran's surrender, while Trump posted publicly that although talks would continue, the ceasefire itself was, in his words, over. This is where the economic story and the diplomatic story collide completely. As of mid-June, the total cost of the war to American taxpayers was already estimated at over $113 billion. Oil markets reacted instantly to the renewed instability. Brent crude climbed back above $79 a barrel after the fresh strikes, still well below the wartime peak of roughly $112 a barrel hit back in May, but a clear signal that markets were pricing in the real possibility of another full-scale escalation. Shipping data told the same story in real numbers. Before the war, roughly 110 vessels crossed the Strait of Hormuz every single day. In the days immediately after the July collapse, that number fell to somewhere between 6 and 15 ships in a 24-hour period, according to marine traffic data, alongside a noticeable rise in GPS spoofing around the waterway, a form of navigational interference that makes ships appear in false locations. And underneath all of it, Iran's own domestic situation kept deteriorating. Iranian state media reported that strikes had knocked out roughly 4,200 megawatts of national grid capacity, leaving millions of people without reliable power in the middle of brutal summer heat. An Iranian military spokesperson warned publicly that the flames of war will engulf the entire region if the fighting resumed at scale. Meanwhile, funeral ceremonies for the slain Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei only concluded in early July, months after his death, with his son and successor Mojtaba reportedly staying away from public appearances entirely, even during his own father's burial. Intelligence shared between Israel and the United States has also reportedly pointed to a new Iranian plot to assassinate President Trump, according to sources cited by CNN, adding another layer of volatility to an already combustible situation. By July 13th, the same naval blockade that was lifted back in June was already being reinstated. CENTCOM announced U.S. forces would resume blockading Iranian ports, effective that same week, citing Iran's continued interference with commercial shipping through Hormuz. Qatari and Pakistani mediators were reported traveling back and forth between Tehran and Washington, trying to pull both sides back from the edge one more time. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, standing at that same NATO summit in Ankara, reminded both American and Iranian leaders of the sheer economic cost of returning to open war. Meanwhile, a separate but connected front had already reopened in Lebanon. Israeli strikes continued to hit targets in the country's south, testing the limits of the ceasefire signed with Hezbollah back in June. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun reportedly tied his country's continued participation in talks with Israel to the start of a military withdrawal from occupied southern areas, with another round of negotiations expected in Rome and a planned meeting between Aoun and President Trump in Washington later in July. It's a reminder that this was never really one war contained neatly inside one border. It was a web of overlapping fronts, Iran, Israel, Lebanon, and the open water of Hormuz, all connected by the same fragile set of agreements, any one of which could unravel the entire structure at once. And still, as of this recording, no one can say with confidence whether the Versailles memorandum will hold, whether the blockade will trigger another round of strikes, or whether the war that supposedly ended on May 5th has in practical terms already begun again. So here's the real question underneath everything we just walked through. Helios was built to solve one very specific problem. How do you cheaply defeat a cheap drone without bleeding your own treasury dry in the process? And on that narrow question, the technology may genuinely be working, even if the exact combat record remains unconfirmed. But the laser was never going to solve the larger problem sitting underneath it. A ceasefire signed at a palace in France couldn't guarantee peace over a 30-mile wide strait half a world away. A memorandum could pause the missiles, but it couldn't erase a decade of distrust between Washington and Tehran, or settle who actually controls the most important oil choke point on the planet. The real lesson of this entire story isn't about lasers at all. It's about how a single overlooked stretch of water can undo months of diplomacy in a matter of days. And how the cheapest weapons in this war, drones costing $20,000 each, may end up shaping the outcome just as much as the aircraft carriers, the missile defense systems, and the 60-kilowatt lasers built to stop them. If this story raises many questions for you as it did for me while putting it together, drop a comment and tell me what you think happens next in the Strait of Hormuz standoff. Do you think the Versailles memorandum survives? Or do you think this war is already quietly restarting in front of us? I read every comment and I want to hear your honest take. If you found this breakdown valuable, share it with someone who needs to understand just how fragile the peace in this region actually is right now. Make sure you're subscribed to Cartovex Media so you don't miss the next update the moment new developments break. Because based on everything we just covered, this story is very far from finished. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.